Today, you see farms. But 400 years ago, in the early 1600s, all of this was tropical grassland. And it was inhabited by Austronesian peoples who hunted and harvested off this rich land. Now, these people weren't ignorant of the outside world. They may have been insular islanders, but they traded with Japanese and Chinese merchants for foreign goods, salt, iron and steel tools, fabrics. They brought those home, and in turn they traded deer skins and local products. Now when they went home to fortified villages, and you might wonder why on an island paradise you need fortifications. Well, it wasn't a paradise. Truth be told, these natives engaged in constant warfare, headhunting, massacre, and so they were in an environment of constantly shifting alliances, jockeying for advantages, and alternating between peace and war in order to maintain some semblance of a balance of power. And uniquely, in this environment of intertribal warfare, there actually arose a kingdom. And the sad thing is, most people, even Taiwanese people, have never heard it. So, what exactly was Middag? The kingdom of Middag, as far as we know, had no writing system, no written records that have survived the test of time. So what we do know of the kingdom actually come from the Dutch and the Chinese accounts. Now it seems that this was a little less of a kingdom and more of a tribal alliance between the Papua, Babuza, Pazeh, and Hawaiian peoples, all unified under the rule of one king. Now that's a big deal, because remember, 400 years ago this land was dotted with hundreds, thousands of villages, and each of these villages or towns was essentially its own little country. So for 27 of them to all unite as one nation under one ruler, whether it's by force or cooperation, that's pretty significant. Now this king at one point would have ruled over 27 towns at the height of his power, and he was known as the Leilan, or the Sun King. He may not have actually been a king in the traditional European or Chinese sense. In fact, he probably was a leader that held multi-faceted roles. For one, he held blessings for all the peoples within the kingdom. He was probably a ritual and cultural leader. He most likely mediated between tribes, making sure that disputes didn't break out to help ensure that unity. And he was probably the outward-facing representative of the kingdom, the diplomat, if you will. So this king may not have been a ruler as we see him in the West or even in the East, but he might have been a multifaceted leader that functioned to keep the people together. And when he traveled throughout his domain, he traveled with only one or two attendants at any time. He definitely wasn't this sort of emperor with an imperial guard, nothing like that. The leader, the Leilan, at the time of Dutch invasion, was known as Kamachat Aslami, and at that time he ruled over 17 towns. While definitely not as powerful as they once were, they were powerful enough to give the Dutch a hard time. In fact, they would have to face three, not just one, three waves of colonization. When the Dutch set about trying to conquer Taiwan and establishing their colony, Dutch Formosa, they definitely met heavy resistance. See, the Pingputsu, the Plains tribes, they were no stranger to war and diplomacy. They knew politics. Some of them tried to get assistance from Japan. Others formed tribal alliances to try to fight the Dutch. And some tried treachery, some rebelled. Because life under Dutch rule wasn't always great. Yes, you gained access to steel tools, yes. There was a more powerful overlord to help protect you with all their guns and cannon. However, the Dutch extracted heavy tributes. They demanded that your warriors fight for them anytime they had their own battles and wars with other tribes. And they also extracted sex slaves from the tribes as part of the tribute. However, although they did sometimes suffer heavy losses, the Dutch were largely successful. And I attribute this to three advantages. One, fortresses. The Dutch had their Renaissance era fortresses, which were extremely hard for the Aboriginal warriors to besiege. So that means when the Dutch secured an area, it was very hard to dislodge them, as long as they had enough supplies. Secondly, the Dutch martial arts, their manner of open field combat was in some ways superior. The Dutch discipline by this time was world famous. They used the countermarch to provide rows of musketeers, and those musketeers would provide withering musket fire, volley after volley after volley. And that kind of firepower was something that the Plains Aborigines were just not prepared for, at least not initially. And lastly, the Dutch may have been just even more sophisticated in their civil governments and their ability to divide and conquer. Now, the Dutch made their way north, and they eventually came upon our Kingdom of Middag. And when the Dutch initially invaded, the united forces of the Kingdom of Middag actually drove them out with a fierce counterattack, a win for tribal unity. Unfortunately, Captain Peter Boone came back later with a large detachment of Dutch forces, probably with some native auxiliaries, and they destroyed some 11 to 13 towns within this Kingdom of Middag. If you remember, at that time, they had 17 towns under their rule, under the Gamanchad Aslami's rule. And so, eventually, the kingdom was subjugated, but it still remained somewhat autonomous. See, like I said, the Dutch typically provide overlordship and extract heavy tribute. In this case, although they did divide the land into 6 sections, leased out to Fujianese farmers which were working for the Dutch, the king remained the king of the land. And as such, he forbade missionaries from doing their work here, and he also forbade the Dutch from settling. He made sure that they were only allowed to go through the kingdom and not stay. Perhaps he knew that missionaries would undermine his ritual, cultural, and eventually political authority, and might be the force to dissolve the kingdom. Unfortunately, an even more brutal colonist would show up after the Dutch. The Dutch had a good thing going on, at least for themselves. They had Chinese farmers developing the land and making it profitable for them. They had Aboriginal warriors policing those same Chinese and providing soldiery for the Dutch. But it wouldn't last. Eventually, the Dutch were driven out by a very interesting and famous figure in Taiwanese and Chinese history, Zheng, the Ming loyalist, the pirate king, the half-Fujianese Japanese warlord. Now, Zheng would eventually beat the Dutch, but it wasn't an easy war. And while his forces were besieging Fort Zeelandia, they were running low on food. So they did what any army did back in the day, and they scoured the countryside, pillaging and plundering. Zheng actually sent one of his generals, Yang Zu, up to the northern area where the Kingdom of Middag was located, and they invaded with 500 veteran soldiers. But they didn't know what they were up against. The forces of the Kingdom of Middag, the brave and skillful warriors, they tricked and massacred that entire contingent. However, when Zheng did beat the Dutch and set up the Kingdom of Dongning and established the Qing Dynasty, they came back with a vengeance. More than 3,000 Chinese soldiers, Fujianese soldiers, were sent up north to deal with the Kingdom of Middag, and the warriors of Middag numbered only in the high hundreds. They fought valiantly, but they were defeated. In fact, at one of the villages known as Salu Se, the Chinese formed a killing ring and massacred the entire town down to 6 people. That was the nature of warfare. It had changed from the Dutch model of subjugation to obedience or eradication. This was what Middag was up against, and yet, they survived the Kingdom of Dongning. just like the Dutch, Dutch and Zheng's kingdom was not to last either. And when he was ousted, or his descendant, the Manchurian Qing Dynasty took over Taiwan. Now, they may not have ruled in the same fashion as the previous two, but they definitely were not benevolent rulers. Rebellions, whether they're Hakka, Hoklo, or Yuanzumin, Aboriginal, were all put down brutally. And the people were definitely oppressed. The kingdom of Middag still existed at this time, but they too suffered. The Pingpuzu, the Aboriginal people, the Plains Aborigines of the kingdom of Middag and elsewhere in Taiwan, were put under extreme labor requirements by the empire. And naturally, like many of the people of Taiwan, they rebelled. In fact, while the kingdom of Middag was a shadow of its former self, it launched one of the largest indigenous rebellions against the Qing Dynasty that there ever was in the history of Taiwan. But unfortunately in 1732, they too were crushed. And of all the tribes, Hoanya, Papora, Papuza, Pazeh, only the Pazeh survived. They fled into what is now Nantou, the interior of Taiwan. The rest, slaughtered or assimilated. The kingdom of Middag is gone. It's gone physically. The people are separated. Few of them survive. Culturally, no longer intact. And of course, we barely remember them. Hopefully you do, now that you watched this video. There are a few strong takeaways. You know, maybe if they had diplomacy with Japan, the Qing Dynasty, Dutch and Zheng, the Dutch, maybe they could have survived even as just a vassal state. Strategic depth, they were up on the plains. Maybe if they had conquered into the foothills, they may have been able to hold out better against 3 waves of colonization. And unity. Unity is a constant problem with 4 different ethnic groups, 27 or less towns united. I can only imagine that that was very hard to keep together, but without a unified purpose, no nation can stand together. Not in the face of such dangerous and harsh opponents. I hope that this story of Middag gives us a few good lessons. You know, no matter how strong you are, you need preparation, you need friends, you need conviction and purpose. If we don't learn these lessons, it was just a nice story. But history is useless to us without meaning. And so I hope you found meaning in the kingdom of Middag. Thank you.